How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. If you're here for today's video, you're officially on tier 2 of the medical conspiracy, or the medicine iceberg as we've called it so far. If you haven't watched the first one, I'd highly recommend that you go back and check it out, but it is not really pre-reading that you need to get into today's video. I'll say that the jump from tier 1 to tier 2 is pretty significant. We definitely get into a lot of ideas here today that are way more complicated than you would see on tier 1. And I could say with certainty that I don't think there will be a single one of you, or in the very least, there will be quite a minority of you that will have heard of every single item on tier 2. This is when we start getting to the obscure things. Having said that though, the jump from tier 2 to 3 and 4 gets even steeper, so stay tuned for those. I'll say that if you're interested in this stuff, please go ahead, let me know what your favorite item on the iceberg was in the comment section below. Please add things that you want to see show up on future tiers, and like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, because it really helps me get these videos out faster. I'm currently on my ICU rotation right now, so apologies for the delay between the first and the second video. It's just that trying to find a solid block of 2 to 3 hours to film a video like this when I'm on call for 24 hours apiece multiple times a week has really been kind of difficult, but that's where we're at now. So without further ado, here's tier 2. Tier 2 is called the medical student, and it opens like this. You finally made it. Years of reading, memorizing, testing have all led to this. But you know, moving from the pond to the ocean is humbling to say the least, and meticulous details are the name of the game now. To be fair, the truth has always been there, staring back at you as you read between the lines. But how are you even supposed to have known what you were looking at? Try these glasses on, kid. In time, you will be great. But for now, let's take a closer look. Now, the first item on tier 2 is Operation PX, otherwise known as Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night, and our introduction to biological warfare. What you need to know for the background is that biological warfare has been around for hundreds of years, for centuries. And back in the day, Middle Ages, they would fling corpses over castle walls into courtyards in an effort to spread disease, mostly plague. Their understanding of how that worked wasn't really the best at the time. Nonetheless, we do have documentation that we really think that it's been done. However, really, in this century here, the transition to what's known as modern warfare really only comes about with the advent of gunpowder and more modern tactics that you see in warfare. In that regard, Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night was an effort that was planned by the Japanese during World War II to spread weaponized bubonic plague, as well as dengue fever and typhus, on the United States in coastal cities like San Diego and Los Angeles. Now, the plan, for the most part, was a two-pronged approach where seaplanes would spread these pathogens over the cities via the skies, and on the other hand, the submarine crew would infect themselves with all of these pathogens, run into the battlefield as like a suicide type of mission, and infect as many people as they can, or that was the hope. The operation was entirely called off by the general, and then afterwards was explained with the following sentence, which was pretty chilling. If bacteriological warfare is conducted, it will grow from the dimension of war between Japan and America to an endless battle of humanity against bacteria. And to me, I find it really interesting that even amongst all of the atrocities committed during World War II, we had people at the time that understood that there are some lines that you should not cross. Biological warfare being one of those to threaten all of humanity. Unfortunately though, as many of you probably know, we don't really learn when it comes to warfare. So there's a lot more to talk about with that, many advancements since then. Stay tuned for later tiers. The next one is Tim Fried and the Human Antivenin Project. Tim was a gentleman who on YouTube was posting videos of himself getting bit by some of the most venomous snakes in the entire world. I've seen some of the videos myself, and they're crazy. So he gets bit by a taipan, a cobra, basically anything that you could really think of, and has this remarkable ability in his body to neutralize the snake venom and not die. Now, to be fair, Tim has actually been declared clinically dead, I believe on at least one occasion, after he was bit by multiple cobras on the same day. But moving forward, he made it his life's mission to inject himself with as much dangerous snake venom as is possible, in the hopes that he may one day be able to use some of his blood and the antibodies that his body is producing against the venom as a universal snake vaccine. In the most recent update, it seems like he is actually working with a very qualified immunologist. There is a company that they've put together, and they're currently doing research to develop what will possibly be, hopefully, if everything works out the way they think, humanity's ability to totally conquer snake bites altogether. Next, we have the Demon Core and the concept of the Walking Dead. So, in keeping with our World War II theme from just recently, after the 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were actually plans for more bombs to be created if they didn't surrender. One of those bombs, the third bomb, was in preparation, and there was a plutonium core that they would use in the center of this bomb that would later be known as the Demon Core. Now, because Japan surrendered, this was never actually turned into a bomb, but was kept at the Los Alamos testing lab in the United States to be used for experimentation and demonstrating different nuclear physics. Now, I'll have some pictures up on the screen, but without going into the details of nuclear fission, all you need to know is that there was this block, this sphere of radioactive plutonium that was being worked on in two separate incidences. The first with a man named Harry Dolly, and the second was a physicist called Louis Slotin. Basically, in these events, you had the Demon Core come in contact with another material that allowed it to produce a massive amount of radiation. And the way that radioactive poisoning works in this case is that the closer you are to this object letting out the radiation, the more you're going to be affected. So there were other people in the room, but these physicists were very, very close to where the Demon Core had let out all of this radiation. The more famous one is the second incident with Louis Slotin, because it was reported that when he made the Demon Core come in contact with the other compound and receive the fatal dose of radiation, there was a bright blue flash, a lot of heat felt as well, but then afterwards, he was fine, or at least it appeared as though he was fine. But he said out loud, oh well, I guess that does it then, because he already knew that he was going to die. Louis Slotin actually ended up dying 9 days after the incident of acute radiation syndrome, but the concept of the Walking Dead comes into the fact that this was a person that had this acute exposure, probably felt relatively okay afterwards, just pretty shook up, but knew that their days were numbered and had to go about living for the next couple days, knowing that they were eventually going to die a slow and painful death. Next, we have a really interesting concept called the speed of life. And basically, the background here is that there is an inverse relationship that we've known about, it seems like, for a very long time, between the amount of heartbeats that an organism's heart will beat per minute in mammals and how long they will live. What I mean by that is that the faster your heartbeat goes, probably the sooner that you'll die, with some studies even concluding that every mammal, for the most part, seems to get about 1 billion beats throughout their entire lifetime. Now, personally, I'm kind of skeptical about the 1 billion beat number, but really interesting examples are like the hummingbird that has an average heart rate of between 500 and 1200 in many cases, depends on the species and the level of activity, but their life expectancy seems to be about 3 to 5 years, and if you do that math, that 1 billion number doesn't seem too unrealistic. As it applies to humans, though, I think the more interesting thing is that we know that athletes and people with lower resting heart rates on average seem to live longer lives than people with conditions like diabetes, like stimulant use, like cigarette smoking, that increases average resting heart rate and is associated with earlier cardiac death. Now, this one here has so many different branches to follow and things that we will talk about coming up. Please go ahead and do some more research on this one if you're interested. But xenotransplantation, if you've never heard of the concept before, refers to the ability to take something from one organism and put it in someone else. Now, I'm not talking about taking a piece like a particular muscle, like a calf muscle or a quadricep muscle off of a cadaver, a dead person, and putting it into another person. That would be called an allograft. And if you took something like your skin cells or a piece of you and saved it for later and then reattached it to yourself later on, or put it from one place on your body somewhere else, we call that an autograft. Xenografts, from the root word xeno, meaning foreign or different, is the act of taking something from one species in many cases and putting it in people. Now, some of the craziest examples of this are the experiments by Dr. Voronoff, where he believed, one of his philosophies, and he had many, was taking testicles from monkeys, from chimpanzees, and surgically attaching them or inserting them into older men in the thought that you would restore youth and vitality as a result. Now, the first time I came across this was like years ago. So to anyone that just did a double take, yeah, you heard me right. There was a doctor in the 1920s named Sergei Voronoff who was taking monkey testicles and putting them in people in an effort to restore vitality. Those experiments did not work out. That's not something that we're still doing today, but xenografts are things that we're doing, and we will talk about them later on as well. The next one is the concept of something called genetic anticipation, and really where you'll come across that in your studies in medical school usually, is for a disease called Huntington's chorea. Now, if you've never heard of Huntington's before, you're lucky. And that means, hopefully it's not something that runs in your family, because it is a terrible condition. Chorea, from the root word meaning dancing-like activity, is a neurodegenerative condition that is inherited. So it's autosomal dominant, meaning that if either of your parents have the condition, you could draw the Punnett square out yourself. There is a chance that you end up inheriting a gene that gives you this neurodegenerative condition that is fatal 100% of the time. We do not have any treatments available to cure Huntington's disease, unfortunately. Now, this concept raises so many ethical dilemmas, and the concept of screening will come up later on in the iceberg. But basically, as far as genetic anticipation goes, the saddest part about Huntington's is that in addition to the fact that you inherit it from your parents, it seems like every generation that inherits the Huntington's gene will end up getting symptoms and dying earlier on. Now, we think that the reason why this is the case is because the amount of base pair repeats in the Huntington's gene actually expands with every successive generation. Practically, what this means, unfortunately, is that if your dad died of Huntington's disease when he was 45 and you inherit the Huntington's allele, there is a good chance that you will end up dying before age 45. The next item is what's called the Genius Sperm Bank, otherwise known as the Central Repository for Germinal Choice, was a sperm bank selectively taking in samples originally from people who had won a Nobel Prize, and then afterwards even people who hadn't won a Nobel Prize but were thought to have had a very, very high IQ. Now, what are we talking about here? Eugenics, for the most part. We're talking about a sperm bank selectively for people who were thought to have genius level IQ in the hopes of producing children through artificial insemination that would have higher levels of intelligence. Now, from what I've seen online, the site was located in California. I believe it was closed in 1999. There are confirmed reports of women who did receive some of the donations and did go on to have children as a result. But as far as we know, the program has been totally shut down. Now, off the record, there are different reports. I personally would not be surprised, even though nothing has been confirmed, if there is not some sort of private agency like this located somewhere in the world. Listen, crazier things have happened. I'm sure there's something like this going on somewhere. Listen, I am not a conspiracy theorist. It lends itself very nicely to the video, though. I'm just trying to be realistic. It's already happened. There's already been a genius sperm bank. Would it really surprise you if there's not another one that exists shadily off the record somewhere on some... I'm just saying. Next, we have the concept of a cognitohazard. And this is actually kind of difficult to explain to someone if you've never come across this term before. But basically, there are people out there where if you believe in cognitohazards, if you're the type of person that's affected by it, get very, very uncomfortable with this subject. So please feel free to move on if this is not something that you want to hear about. But a cognitohazard refers to a topic, something that the very act of you learning about it puts you at danger if that concept turns out to be true. Now, in modern internet culture, probably the most famous example is the concept of Roko's Basilisk. And if you've never heard of it before, this is your last chance to back out now before I tell you about it if you're affected by cognitohazards. This is really important to medicine because we see people all the time that have really bad anxiety, really bad delusions. For the most part, those are who cognitohazards are affecting more often than not. The concept of Roko's Basilisk is that if you look out into the distant future, that there might be some sort of AI god named Roko's Basilisk. And the concept is this thought experiment that if you knowing about the eventual possibility of an AI all-powerful entity and you did not do absolute everything in your power to make that come into reality, then in the future, will this thing actually come back into the past through whatever mean to get rid of you or to make your life a living hell as it is right now? The reason why this is called a cognitohazard is because if you didn't know about the concept of Roko's Basilisk, then this all-powerful AI god in the future would have no reason to come back and punish you now for something that you never knew about. But the fact that you've now been told from me about this concept puts you in danger of eventual torture unless you now do everything in your power to make this come into reality. Tying back to medicine, people with schizophrenia, people with really bad anxiety, these types of delusions are incredibly difficult to treat in a clinical context. So as a doctor, even just talking to my friends, you sometimes come across the saying that medicine is poison. This next entry literally refers to medicine being poison, and it refers to warfarin, which is a blood thinner that we have. Story goes back to like the 1930s, where there was a farmer, Ed Carlson, I think was his name just in my readings, had noticed that some of his cows were dying after eating this like moldy clover that was growing in the fields. Brought some of the samples of the moldy clover as well as some sample from his cows to a vet and a biochemist, and in some investigation they found out that it was the chemical within the clover that made the clover sweet that was also giving it properties that anticoagulated the blood, so it thinned out the blood. Now, through some experimentation, they found out that the chemical itself was called coumadin, or it was a certain derivative of that chemical that was leading to the anticoagulation properties. And what do you do with this newly discovered chemical that thins out the blood? Well, at the time, before they could get it approved for human trials, they first used it in small rodents like mice and rats, because while it was not lethal in humans at the doses that they were testing, it was lethal in rats. And as a result, it took off in that industry, hit the market in about 1948 as a rat poison, and then was approved for human use in the early 50s. But in the beginning, no one, especially doctors, no one wanted to prescribe this medication for a heart attack and other conditions if it was currently being used as a rat poison. This all changed in 1955 after US President Dwight D. Eisenhower had a heart attack and was very successfully treated with warfarin. Everyone's perception about the medication changed, and warfarin has been used by patients for many, many years, still used to this day, not as frequently. It did start off as a rat poison. And on that note, according to the National Library of Medicine, an organization of the United States, it looks like approximately 7,000 to 9,000 patient-related deaths are reported every single year as a result of medication errors. Now, that's a huge number. It's also a recent number as of 2023. One of the most famous examples in the last little while that's made its way into the media is the story about a nurse who accidentally administered a medication called vecuronium, which paralyzes the muscles and stops you from breathing, instead of a medication that was supposed to be given called Versed, which is an anti-anxiety medication. It's a benzodiazepine. On a separate but related note, I have a short on my channel talking about how crazy drug names are, but like trying to memorize in medical school that certain drugs, like the same drug, could have 3 or more different names talking about the exact same thing, and even 2 different medications that are like totally different classes, very dangerous to get confused. In some cases sound very, very similar. Like the naming convention just sucks sometimes. This next one I'm calling Archaic Treatments, with probably the single worst shock value example that I was able to find. If you guys know a different one that trumps this, please let me know in the comment section below. But treatment of gout in the 1500s has come a long way nowadays. But first of all, gout is what's known as a monoarthropathy, meaning that typically it's a severe pain that affects a single joint. It can affect multiple joints, but it's not one of those things where like rheumatoid arthritis comes on throughout the entire body. Many people, their first incidence of a gout attack is the big toe. We call that podagra. But gout for years has been a problem, and it's in the past been known as the king's disease, because we think that the reason people develop gout, or one of the most significant reasons, is by eating diets that are high in things called purines. So alcohol, seafood, red meat, all increase your chance of getting this king's disease known as gout. Now, as a result, this has been around forever. It's a disease of luxury. In the 1500s, the kings, for example, were a particular susceptibility to it, and at the time, treatment for gout in the 1500s was a concoction including eating roasted goose stuffed with pieces of chopped up kitten that they would put inside this concoction as well. So eating kittens to cure gout, and archaic medicine. Shock value example number 2, I'm just going to tack in here. Most of you know it already, but if you don't already know it, then I have to let you know. Between the 15th and 17th century, some European cultures also ate Egyptian mummies, so much so that there was this whole industry about Egypt exporting mummies, and there was a whole big business operation. They were running out of mummies. They had to create more. Look into the history, but they would eat mummies, so actual cannibalism, for everything from headaches to stomach aches to anything else for medicinal purposes. This next one is our tier 2 look at cloning, and this one's called Dolly the Sheep, Human Cloning, and the US President. Basically what happens here is that in 1996, at this point in our cloning timeline, many advancements have happened since the first introduction of cloning or the concept of cloning in the 1800s. At this point, Dolly the sheep becomes the first ever mammal to be cloned with a relatively new process at the time called somatic cell transfer. And basically what you're doing here is you're getting an egg cell, an oocyte, and you enucleate it, and then you get a somatic cell from a totally different organism. You take that nucleus out, you put it inside this egg cell, and as a result, this embryo eventually divides and forms an organism that is a genetic copy of whatever organism you took that other cell from. Now, this in and of itself is a huge accomplishment, especially at the time, because to think that you were going to take, in Dolly's case, a cell from breast tissue and use that as the foundation to create every single different type of cell in an organism's body was wild for people to wrap their head around. There's reasons why this is possible. We might talk about it later in tier 4, very likely. But what happens afterwards is that you have Dolly, the sheep, and a few others as well that come from this process. One thing that they noticed, though, is that the cells that were used to make Dolly were taken from a sheep that was about 6 years old at the time. Dolly, on the other hand, developed osteoarthritis and signs of aging, and and eventually ended up dying when she herself was 6 years old, about half the lifespan of a full lifespan of a sheep. I feel like nowadays we might be a little bit desensitized to this concept of cloning, but in 1996 and the years that followed, there was a media firestorm that came about with this news. So many different things just stoking the fire. On the one hand, you had the concerns that the cloning process made organisms that were in some way defective, even though, as it turns out, a lot of other sheep from Dolly's flock that were also made with this process lived normal lives, according to scientists. But in addition, you had this mounting public pressure about our role as people and what that meant to clone other individuals, playing God, and the ramifications if you could make genetically identical copies of people with a similar process. Then you have to contend with the oocyte harvesting process as well, and there are just so many ethical dilemmas that I'm sure you could think of. Now, for now, we'll put a pin in this topic right here by saying that human cloning was banned in 2005 in the United States finally, after the ball of legislation had already been rolling for a while. Almost every country in the world has followed suit since then, and at the time when it was actually banned, President Bush was in office, but President Clinton was still in office when the concept of human cloning and Dolly was really being talked about by the news. And President Clinton's earliest statement regarding human cloning was that the technology has the potential to threaten the sacred family bonds at the very core of our ideals and our society. He also noted, however, that there is nothing inherently immoral or wrong with these new techniques if they are not used to clone humans, because they hold the potential of revolutionary new medical treatments and life-saving cures. We'll come back to that later. Next, we have the Schmidt Pain Index, and Justin Schmidt was an entomologist who made it his mission before he passed away to get stung by as many venomous insects as is possible, not to create some sort of anti-venom like we previously talked about, but to characterize the intensity, the pain of each sting on a scale from 1 to 4, with 4 being the absolute worst. In addition to rating the stings from 1 to 4, he also wrote little descriptions, poetic in some cases, about every single sting that he experienced. And my favorite by far has to be from the 4 out of 4 grade tarantula hawk that Schmidt describes as blinding, fierce, shockingly electric. A running hairdryer has been dropped into your bubble bath. A bolt out of the heavens. Lie down and scream. I love everything about the Schmidt Pain Index because it shows me that, like, we all just have different callings in life, right? Like, I'm really into medicine. Sometimes I make videos on the internet. I'm sure you guys are all into different stuff. How many of us honestly could say that we've ever wanted to do something like this? I don't care how bored I've been. I've never had this thought even remotely cross my mind to sting myself with a tarantula hawk and write about it. For this next one, I gotta keep the Wikipedia entry open just to help me remind myself, because there's a few details here. This one here is about surgeons who have operated on themselves, to which there have been multiple, which surprised me at first, but one story stands out in particular about Dr. Leonid Rogozov, who was a Siberian surgeon, who was in Antarctica on an exploratory mission, a scientific expedition, and developed appendicitis and then operated on himself because he was the only surgeon there. So let me just read you this entry about him. So, on the morning of the 29th of April, 1961, he developed general weakness, nausea, and a moderate fever, and later pain in the right lower portion of his abdomen. None of the positive conservative treatments helped, and by April 30th, signs of localized peritonitis became apparent, which is not a good sign if you have appendicitis. The operation started at 0200 local time on the 1st of May with the help of a driver and a meteorologist who provided instruments and held a mirror so that Rogozov could observe areas not directly visible. He lay in a semi-reclining position, half turned to his left side, used a 0.5 solution of Novocaine for local anesthesia of the abdominal wall, and went to town with the surgery. Now, 2 things to note. When I first read the story, and some of you might think this as well, I'm like, no way, dude. Like, there's not a chance. Like, pictures or it didn't happen seems to be the motto for something like this. But they had them because as he was doing the operation, other members of the team that weren't directly involved were actively taking pictures, and then he actually won the Order of the Red Banner of Labor when he returned back to the Soviet Union later on. The other thing is that in some accounts that I've seen, now I can't confirm this for sure, but I like to think that it's true, supposedly in the middle of the operation, or maybe before, one of his assistants had made the suggestion to give him alcohol to drink to help numb the pain a little bit more. And to which he declined, because not only is he the patient, he's also the surgeon. I could just picture, having gone through medical school and residency myself and making a stupid suggestion to your attending every now and then, just the look of disappointment in a man doing surgery on himself only to hear some dumb suggestion from someone about getting drunk while doing it. We have comparisons and reflections on miasma theory versus germ theory with one of my absolute favorite stories. Background here said germ theory is our currently accepted model of how diseases transmit. Basically, whether it's a bacteria, a virus, a fungi, in order for you to get sick with an infectious cause, there needs to be some infectious agent called a pathogen that spreads disease from one person to the other. Now, you could have vectors. Vectors are things that spread pathogens themselves. So, for example, West Nile virus is transmitted by a mosquito. West Nile virus itself is the pathogen and the vector of transmission is the mosquito. Thing is though, before germ theory really took root, which was like the 1850s, for hundreds of years, we had absolutely no idea what pathogens even were. And as a result, there needed to be an adoption of some sort of theory that could explain many of the observations people were seeing without having access to findings that you couldn't really see without a microscope. So miasma theory was the predecessor to germ theory that said that infection was spread through bad airs that came out from things like corpses and other areas associated with sickness, and this bad air would travel from place to place, and as a result, if you inhaled in this bad air, you would get sick as a result. And you could see the connection between how miasma theory was the predecessor for what was eventually germ theory. Now, my favorite story about miasma theory is Pope Clement VI in and around the 1340s to 1350s. Basically, at the time, miasma theory was the predominant theory, and the Pope's advisors recommended that to avoid getting sick, he should stay in the center of La Basilica di San Pietro, the center of where the Vatican is, light 2 bonfires in there, and these roaring bonfires would stop this bad air from moving in. And certainly enough, the Pope did it and he didn't get sick. What they didn't know though is that the actual vector that transmitted Yersinia pestis, which is the pathogen that causes plague, were fleas and rats. And a roaring bonfire also kept those things away, which is probably why the Pope didn't end up getting sick. This one, for the sake of not having this video taken down by YouTube, is called the Unalive Pill. And basically, potassium cyanide was a compound that was first used in pills given to members of the military in around World War II if they were captured by the enemy forces in a mission that involved them in hostile territory. The reason why you would want to take this pill is to very, very quickly induce death so that you could avoid important information being leaked that would jeopardize the entire country, as well as to avoid torture, because as we know from history, there are many, many things that are worse than death, especially when it involves torture and World War scenarios. Now, the way that cyanide kills is that it activates cytochrome C oxidase in the aerobic respiration pathway within the mitochondria producing ATP. If you take a lethal dose, which is very, very low, you will have unconsciousness in seconds, death within minutes, as all of the tissues in your body are unable to make the energy that they need, and you essentially die of cellular hypoxia. More doctors smoke Camel cigarettes than any other type of cigarette in the 1950s. Now, for those of you that haven't heard about the ridiculous kind of history of cigarette research and its links to lung cancer, the short of it is that by the 1950s, we had pretty good evidence that cigarettes were one of the leading causes of this explosion of cases in the United States of lung cancer. Now, the ad that you'll see up on the screen was actually aired in 1946, but even though this research came about in the 50s, what you then had was, faced with this mounting scientific pressure of research, the cigarette companies kind of all came together and said, well, at this point, the data is alarming, but more research needs to be done. And so they made their own scientific division to run their own privately funded scientific studies to show that smoking cigarettes weren't the cause of lung cancer. Now, in my opinion, this has always shown me that sometimes not even doctors are immune to bad science, and we really, really need to be careful about looking at data that is put out by companies with privately funded studies when the results of these studies help these companies make millions, if not billions of dollars. Now, one bonus fact here is that nowadays we know that cigarette smoke is so closely related to negative health outcomes in many different instances, and as a result, these companies stand to lose millions or billions of dollars and have invested very heavily into pushing electronic cigarettes as a safe alternative, when in reality, it looks like this is exactly the same thing. We're seeing this episode on the History Channel a second time, and I feel like many people are falling for it. Thalidomide was a medication that was originally marketed to treat anxiety, trouble sleeping, and morning sickness, especially in the first trimester of pregnancy. we later found out that the drug itself caused thousands of miscarriages and probably thousands of birth defects as well. This is one example of why many doctors operate under the 7-year rule, which colloquially states that whenever a new medication comes on the market, we should all probably just sit back and watch it for about 7 years. Because in the case of thalidomide, it was originally shown in experiments to be safe in pregnancy, but only after many years of study did we later make the connection between thalidomide and birth defects. A recent example of where the 7-year rule is being applied by some doctors is the medication Ozempic, with many early reports stating that the medication is safe, effective, and with no long-term side effects, but many other doctors suggesting instead that we should be treating this with caution and watching to see what happens in the future, especially with some conflicting early reports showing different concerns of gastroparesis, cancers, and other conditions. In my time as a doctor thus far, which admittedly is not very long, I've come across many different types of alternative medicine that people have tried to use to optimize their health. I've heard of people drinking concoctions with horse hoof. Actually, had patients tell me about that, but this one might be going too far. Cordyceps mushrooms, otherwise known as the ant brain zombie mushroom. There's a great Nature documentary if you want to see some truly horrific time lapses of this fungus taking over and zombifying insects and making it look like it's actually controlling them to do what they want them to do. Some of the health benefits that people talk about when they're talking about ingesting cordyceps: boost energy and strength, improve immunity, enhance kidney function, and improve sexual dysfunction, as well as treat cough and fatigue. Almost none of these have been verified, by the way. Some people say that they have, but the scientific studies really don't support a lot of it. Right now, cordyceps can't infect the human brain, but important to know that there is no treatment once cordyceps infects an organism. And if there was some way for it to infect people, we could be looking at a very deadly, but right now, preventable condition. Now, let me know where you line up on this topic in the comment section below, please. Maybe I'm the weird one here, but I don't feel like there is anything good that comes from ingesting a parasitic fungus that's sole purpose in life is to infect the brains of other organisms. Polio virus and the iron lung. So if you've ever seen a picture of the iron lung before, what you need to know about that is that it is a negative pressure ventilation apparatus that allows people inside. It's like a vacuum type container with rubber tubing around the neck to make sure it's vacuum sealed, that decreases the amount of pressure inside the container so that you could successfully draw in a breath. That's how breathing works. You're actually decreasing the amount of pressure inside your chest to allow the air to enter inside. The iron lung was first made famous in the polio epidemics of before 1955, because that's when the vaccine came out. What you need to know about polio is that in nature, it is only ever seen in humans, and that the disease progressed basically in 2 different ways. In the first half of the disease, you had poliomyelitis, which was basically a fever, sore muscle pain, shortness of breath, but then in 1 in 200 cases, you had the development of something called post-polio syndrome, which caused irreversible damage of certain muscles, particularly of the diaphragm, which for the rest of your life decreased your ability to breathe, which is why many children that caught the polio virus needed to be placed on an iron lung for the rest of their life. Consanguinity and the negative side effects of inbreeding in people. And I think the easiest way to explain this is looking at examples from dogs. So when you have purebred dogs, like the German Shepherd, for example, certain traits over time have been selected for in that breed, and in order to make sure that they stay in all of the puppies that are bred as a result, you do what's called inbreeding, where you take parents and have children, and then you mate the children back with the parents to keep that desirable trait. In many instances, you're mating brothers and sisters to keep that trait in the lineage that you want. The negative side effect, though, is that whenever something bad shows up in that lineage, when you inbreed 2 animals together, there are no alleles, different copies of genes that could mask those bad genes. And as a result, these genetic errors tend to get worse and worse over time and amplified through years and years of inbreeding. Now, in one of the most dramatic examples that I've ever seen in people, you have a family known as the Blue Fugates of Kentucky, who were a lineage of people that were physically blue. Like you looked at them and they were blue, like you would see on the screen. And this was thought to have been caused by years and years of familial inbreeding within this population. The result of all of this inbreeding was an exacerbation of a trait of methemoglobinemia, which caused blue blood and the visibly blue appearance of the Fugates. Drinking too much water can in fact kill you. And water intoxication in popular culture, I think, has been portrayed too much like drinking alcohol. Like if you drink too much water, then somehow it acts as alcohol and kills you that way. That's not how it works at all. It all has to do with electrolyte abnormalities and hyponatremia in this case. The sodium in your cells If you have too much water, it becomes dilute and your overall sodium level decreases. So in the hospital, we always say that hyponatremia is not a problem of salt, it's a problem of having too much water. Practically, what you need to know is that according to some reports, drinking about 5 liters of water or more in only a couple of hours can dilute your sodium enough to cause symptoms of brain swelling, seizures, coma, and then death. History of the opioid crisis, take 2. And where we last left off in the first year was that we're at the end of the 19th century now, late 1800s. There was a problem that we were noticing, and that's that we were giving morphine to everyone for everything. Toothaches, headaches, menstrual-related problems, and as a result, the amount of use in the population shot up. But what we were seeing is that in addition to the amount of use, there was physiologic dependence, meaning that when you tried to stop using morphine and opioids, your body went through withdrawal symptoms, which are still seen even to this day. But on the other hand, you needed more and more opioids to achieve the same amount of effect as time goes on with you continuing to use opioids. So a company called Bayer comes out in and around this time and introduces a safe alternative to morphine that they call heroin. And heroin was all the rage because it was so much safer. According to the studies that they have funded and put together, to this day, we don't know if they just made up the results altogether or if the studies were done incorrectly. Who's to say? All we know is that we now had a conversion from morphine addiction in the population to a predominantly heroin-based addiction within the population. This was thought of as a more high-class addiction, and at the time, because the concentration of heroin was pharmaceutical grade, for the most part, people were able to crush these tablets and snort it instead of the injectable heroin that we see predominate the scene these days. The problem, though, is that in practice, heroin is usually about twice as potent and effective as morphine, particularly in bringing on symptoms of euphoria, and as a result, you had a transition from morphine to heroin and resulted in people becoming even more addicted to opioids at the start of the 1900s to 1910s. Medical tourism refers to the ability to leave one's country of origin to go somewhere else on a medical vacation, receive healthcare there, and then come back afterwards to where you were originally living. Now, this isn't something new. It's been going on for a very long time. I'll tell you, in my experience as a Canadian doctor working on like a border town here in Niagara Falls, there are many instances where if people could afford it, they go and get an MRI done on the other side of the border in the United States in like a week or a couple days out from when they originally wanted one. Now, in other cases, you have people going to Saudi Arabia, for example, for hair transplants. One of the things that they're known for down there. And in even other cases, you could have instances like people going to places like Taiwan, where organ transplantation is much, much cheaper than they would have in the United States, for example. The Wikipedia entry says that on average, a liver transplant could run you about $300,000 in the United States, whereas in Taiwan, it's somewhere closer to about 91,000 American. Now, the real question is, where are all of these countries, not necessarily looking at Taiwan, but where is everyone getting these cheap organs? That sounds like something that we might save for another tier. The final item on tier 2 is the time-honored tradition of self-experimentation to prove something that you think is true and no one else wants to believe you on when you're a doctor. Okay, so here's the background. Before the 1980s, duodenal as well as gastric ulcers, stomach ulcers for people that know it as such, were not really known in particular how they were caused. Like, there were different hypotheses. Some people thought it was stress related. Some people thought there were genetic susceptibilities that made certain people at increased chances of getting ulcers, but there was no real causative agent or reason why any particular person got an ulcer. And as a result, treatment for it was very shady at best. You can't necessarily treat something properly if you don't know what causes it. In the late 1970s, you had two physicians that came together to study this a little bit more carefully. You had Dr. Barry Marshall as well as Dr. Robin Warren, who proposed that the underlying causative agent for stomach ulcers was a bacteria, which was later named H. pylori. Now, at the time, it was reported that this hypothesis was looked at as basically scientific quackery. Like, it was hard for people to wrap their head around the fact that the stomach is such an acidic structure. How could any bacteria possibly be living in there? And if they were, how could it be causing these diseases that they've been seeing and haven't been able to identify this bacteria so far? But Dr. Marshall knew he was right, and at the time, he was already championing this idea for a number of years. So with his scientific reputation on the line, he first did an endoscopy to make sure that he had no gastric ulcers, and then decided to drink an entire culture bottle of H. pylori bacteria to prove that after doing it, he would in fact develop stomach ulcers. He drank the bacteria, gave it a few days, went back for another scope, and found out that he had given himself stomach ulcers. And I'm sure he was never happier. There's probably never been a man in history that was happier to find out that he had a stomach ulcer. Now, he actually ended up winning a Nobel Prize for this discovery, as well as Dr. Warren, who was on the paper with him. But originally, he thought that after drinking this H. pylori, he was going to get ulcers like a year later, or in the very least a couple of months. Like he knew he was right, but he wasn't really sure about the pathogenesis of this. But sure enough, you drink an entire bottle of the agent that causes stomach ulcers. He was fully infected 3 days later. And with that, we are finally at the end of tier 2, which was definitely my favorite of the 2 so far in terms of just how deep this iceberg goes, though we still have 2 more tiers to go, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff on there. A lot of it is difficult for people to talk about, and there's a lot of shady historical facts from medicine in general, but I think the interesting part is how we learn and where we are now compared to where we've been. It's the reason why reflecting on these things is something that I'm really passionate about, and apparently some other people have liked it too. If you did like today's video, please let me know in the comment section below. Please leave any suggestions that you have. And we'll see you all in the next one. I'm really excited to bring out tier 3. It'll be in the new year. It's definitely going to be longer than a month because these take forever to put together. The last thing that I'll say is that today's mustache that you're seeing right now, I haven't cleaned it up in a while. It's the second last day of November. We've been raising money for men's mental health and men's health, prostate cancer, testicular cancer, suicide prevention. So that's what that's all about. Definitely won't be around in the next one, but it's been a fun month and we did a great job raising some money. So with that, everyone enjoy. See you all in the next one. All the best with everything going on, and take care for now.